I'm Sandy Goldberg, host of Carlos Conversations. And this episode was sparked by a really unique opportunity when two renowned Egyptologists came to the Carlos Museum to view a mummified body from the Old Kingdom of ancient Egypt. It's been at the Carlos since the early part of the 20th century. First, here's Peter Lacavera, curator of Egyptian art at the Carlos Museum. So, Peter, I know that this whole story begins with the person who originally brought this mummy to the Carlos. So can you give us a little synopsis and bring us up to date? How did it get here?
Well, the mummy was purchased in Egypt by William Arthur Shelton, who was a professor of theology in the Candler School of Theology at Emory University. And in 1919, he was invited to go on what was called a joint scientific expedition, which was led by James Henry Breasted, the famous Egyptologist from Chicago. And they went to Egypt and the Near East in the years just after the First World War. And then also on a sort of buying trip. In those days, you could actually acquire things legally and bring them back, to acquire things for Emory for teaching. And he bought several mummies, some from the Cairo Museum. And then he went to Abydos, and he was looking for an early mummy. And so he was able to purchase this mummy at the site of Abydos.
Where a lot of people think of a mummy, they think of something in the whole casing and the sarcophagus. But in this case, we're actually talking about the body.
The body itself. Yeah, there's the remains of the bottom of the coffin that it came in is still there, but we don't have the rest of it.
We're also here with those two Egyptologists that I mentioned. Janet Richards is associate professor in the Department of Near Eastern Studies at the University of Michigan. She's also director of the University of Michigan Abydos Middle Cemetery Project. Abydos was the site of a huge cemetery for royals and other elites in the time of the Old Kingdom. And Salima Ikram is professor of Egyptology at the American University in Cairo. They saw the mummy for the first time on the day that we recorded this conversation. So how rare is this mummy from the Old Kingdom?
It seems to be the only Old Kingdom mummy that exists in the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah, probably less than half a dozen exist in the whole world.
Yeah. So I mean, this is, in terms of mummy science and mummy studies, it's a very unique and precious find. And it really is, from what we've seen about it, it looks very probably to be Old Kingdom. So in fact, Emory has a treasure.
On the very day we had this conversation, they had seen the mummy in person for the first time. Although Peter, of course, had sent them detailed photographs beforehand.
As we discovered this morning, because I'm sure you've seen pictures of it too, Salima, you don't really get the mummy if you're not in the presence of it. It's really extraordinary.
Because people will send you a few pictures and say, what can you say about it? But unless you're really there, you don't get the same effect. You can't see the same level of detail. You can't, you can't smell it and look at the powdery substances or peer inside places that you know need to look at, and things that you notice when you're with the mummy, in the presence of the mummy, are things that don't ever come across in a photograph, no matter how good or cleverly taken the photograph is.
I mean, I'm just agog at how well modeled it is. It's amazing.
It's a fabulous piece of work, because, I mean, looking at this mummy, because generally the mummies that one is so used to looking at tend to be from the New Kingdom, where mummification, you have the brains are taken out of the nose, the internal organs are taken out from a cut in the side, and then, it's washed and bandaged up and then put into its little coffin. But this mummy is very typically Old Kingdom, because you could see that everything was wrapped very beautifully, but wrapped with such detail that the bandages themselves were in fact being modeled like the muscles and the flesh and the skin of the body. So the whole thing was being turned into a linen effigy of itself. And it might have been eviscerated, it might not, we don't know, because there were no canopic jars with it. But that brown powdery substance that you see tends to be just flesh turning into powder and falling apart, because they did have tendons and cartilage pieces that they'd found, hadn't they?
Yeah, the tendons were pretty well preserved. Yeah. But often that's the case in these early ones.
Yeah.
That's all you get.
And that holds the sort of skeleton together, and then
more or less.
and then it's all powder fallen off. But it was interesting because although the cloth had some little holes in it from insects, we couldn't see any sign of fly larvae or anything from within, which would be a signature of bad quality, poor mummification. Because it seems that whatever they did, to the best of their abilities. And certainly, although the preservation level wasn't great, the disintegration wasn't due to domestic beetles or flies or anything else.
Where is Abydos in Egypt?
It's in between Cairo and Luxor, closer to Luxor, north of the Big Bend of the Nile River. And what we refer to as the archaeological site is along 3 to 4 kilometers of the low desert plateau. Abydos is a site which in the pre-dynastic period had scattered cemeteries.
Now, when you say pre-dynastic, that's before the old kingdom.
Before the unified state in the early dynastic period. So leading up to about 3250, 3100 BCE, there are indications even from quite early on that the ancient Egyptians believed that the great opening in the cliffs at Abydos was the entrance to the next world. And that would be why the earliest royal burials were located there. From the moment that the royal cemetery was established out near that opening in the cliffs, no non-royal activity was allowed anywhere on the entire desert plateau for 800 years. Then suddenly, at the end of the 5th dynasty in the later Old Kingdom, or at the very beginning of the 6th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, the central government very clearly decides to build an important cemetery of central government officials there. And they very carefully lay out this cemetery. It includes the tombs of viziers of Egypt. That's the number 2 person in the government. Governors of Upper Egypt, also very important officials.
So that's when this mummy is dated from that period?
If it is really from Abydos, which Shelton's diary seems to indicate, this is the only part of Abydos where it could have come from.
Salim, you were talking about the good wrappings, but how else can we see this as a good quality mummy for its day?
Well, I mean, the thing is that first of all, by the mere fact it comes from Abydos, we know that he must be an elite. Now, the whole mummification feeds into it. We only have the base of the coffin now, but it's a big solid pieces of wood.
Expensive.
Yes. And also they seem to be cedar.
And cedar would have to be imported, right?
Cedar is imported from modern-day Lebanon, and so it's a very high-status thing. It is not cheap, and probably this would have been put into a large limestone sarcophagus,
yes,
such as the kind that Janet's been finding. So right there you've got expensive.
Well, and the labor resources expended in constructing these tombs were enormous.
The way he's mummified is also something that is really indicative. Now, what's cool is that he's lying on his right side, because most of the mummies one has looked at tend to be lying on their left side. And if he's lying on his right side, Janet and I and Peter were trying to work this out,